In this video, we'll introduce Java Server Pages, or JSP, and the very important MVC architecture. So now we know how to use Java servlets to create web applications. In theory, servlets, or anything that lets you process HTTP requests and generate HTTP responses, can be used to create any web application. But after a few homework and labs, you'll probably see that it's not a good idea to use servlet to generate HTML pages. In particular, using print to generate HTML is very tedious and error-prone. Another problem is that both the code for processing and the code for display are mixed together in a Java class. If you want to change CSS styling for a page, for example, you have to modify and recompile Java code. And when you change some processing code, it's very easy to make a mistake and mess up the HTML display. So, is there another way to do this? The answer is yes, and conceptually it's actually quite intuitive. So far we've been doing HTML inside code. How about we try the opposite and do code inside HTML? The result would be something called Java Server Page, or JSP. A JSP can be just like a regular HTML page. For example, let's create one in Eclipse. So, as we can see, in Eclipse we can create a JSP file, and by and large it looks just like a HTML file except for this part. This part is called a directive. There are a few directives in JSP. This one is called the page directive. Page directive is actually not very useful. You can just ignore it, or you can simply delete it. Later we'll learn a couple of more useful directives. We'll come back to directives when we get there. Another thing about the JSP generated by Eclipse is that by default it uses ISO 8859-1 character encoding. If we want to change that, we can go to Preferences, search for encoding, and look for JSP files. So here we can change the default encoding to UTF-8, and next time when we create a new JSP pages, it will have UTF-8 encoding. Now let's add something to that page, and we can say this is a JSP page without J or S. It's really just looks like a HTML page. And in fact, we can access it similar to accessing a HTML page. So if we run this project, and notice that this page is under web content, similar to where we would put HTML pages, and the path to it is hello.jsp.jsp, and we can simply use the path to access it, just like accessing HTML pages. And if, for example, we place it in a folder under web content. So let's say we put it under a folder called examples. And if we refresh, it's no longer at this path, but If we put in examples, we can find it again. This is a excuse me. This is an important difference between JSP pages and servlets. In servlets, we have the so-called servlet mapping. Regardless of which package you put your servlet inside, the path to access the servlet is determined by this URL mapping. For JSP pages, it's just like HTML pages, the URL is determined by the actual path. Before we see how to use JSP to generate dynamic content, let's first understand how JSP works. It turns out that JSP is really just a different way to write servlet. Behind the scene, the application server automatically converts a JSP to servlet, compiles it, and run it as a servlet. Another way to look at it is this. Although JSP looks very much like an HTML page, they are different in an important way. JSP is processed by application server. It's really just a servlet. HTML, on the other hand, is processed by a browser, and it's the output of a servlet or JSP. In other words, one is on the server side and one is on the client side. To see what a servlet converted from JSP looks like, you can look under this folder. The workspace folder .metadata.plugins and this plugin. This is where Eclipse embedded Tomcat server is. So let's go there and see. My workspace folder is here, and .metadata is here, .plugin, and the plugin name is called wst.server core. So wst server core. So here is where Eclipse keeps its embedded Tomcat servers. Some of you probably have several server runtimes defined in your Eclipse. You'll see a few more folders, temp0, temp1, temp2, and so on. I only have one server runtime, and it's under temp0. So once you locate the server folder, if you want to find the JSP servlets converted from JSPs, go under work Catalina localhost and the context name or the project name. So it will be work Catalina localhost, and the context name or project name is JSP MVC. So go here and go through a few more levels of folders, which corresponds to packages, of course, and then you'll find a Java file. This is in fact the servlet file converted from hello.jsp.jsp. The name is hello.jsp_jsp here.java. If we open this up, we can see that, first of all, this class inherits from a class called HTTP JSP base. That's a subclass of HTTP servlet, which means that this class is a servlet itself. Most of the processing is done in the method _JSP service, which has a request parameter and a response parameter, just like doGet and doPost. You may be wondering how one method can handle both GET and POST requests. Remember that in this method, you do have access to HTTP request. Means you can always call request get method to get the method of the request and then do a if-else statement based on the request method. So this allows you to use one method to handle both get and post and other type of requests. One last thing is that you can see our HTML text inside the JSP page become arguments to out.write statements. So in other words, instead of having to do print statements to print out all this ourselves, now the application server automatically generates code to do that for us, which is quite a relief. Now that we know how JSP works, let's see how we can use it to generate dynamic content. There are two ways to do it: the old way, aka the wrong way, and the new way, aka the right way. In the old way, we basically embed Java code in HTML. It works, but usually leads to messy and unmaintainable code. The new way is to treat JSP as a so-called template engine, which is only used for display purpose. Let's use an example to see how these two ways differ. I have a JSP file here called add1.jsp, and the code is here. This is the old way of using JSP. You can see that it's literally embedding Java code inside HTML. Knowing servlet, we can understand the code pretty easily. It gets two request parameters, A and B, convert them into integers, and display the sum. If we run this page, it's indeed what it does. And this is a new way of using JSP. And I also have this page here. If we run it, let's change it to add 2.jsp, and we'll add 11 and 22. It works the same as the other one. But if you look at the code, you can see that the code looks a lot cleaner. This $sign braces syntax is called expression language. We'll talk more about it in the next video. In this video, we'll discuss a little bit more about the old way, as you may still encounter it if you go work for a company and have to maintain some very old code. In the old way, there are three different ways to embed Java code inside HTML: JSP declaration, JSP expression, and JSP scriptlet. They are collectively called JSP scripting elements. As shown in this example, they use very similar tags. All of them start with bracket, percentage sign. But JSP declaration has an exclamation mark, JSP expression has an equal sign, and JSP scriptlet has neither. The easiest way to understand JSP scripting elements is to look at the Java servlet generated from this JSP. I have this JSP here, and let's run it once so that the servlet will be generated. if we go back here, we can see that now we have this Java file called request counter underscore JSP.java. If we open it up, as we mentioned before, the underscore JSP service method is like doGet and doPost combined together. We can see that a JSP expression becomes an argument to a print statement. In other words, basically the expression will be evaluated and the result will be printed out. JSP servlet, on the other hand, simply gets inserted into the servlet verbatim. In other words, it's like putting code directly inside doGet or doPost. JSP declaration is different in the sense that JSP declaration is placed outside the JSP service method. We can use JSP declaration to do some data initialization here, or even creating new methods that can be used by underscore JSP service. When we run the code, we can see that it runs just like what we would expect. The code initializes a counter value, and each request will display the current counter and then increment it. The good thing about the old way is that it's just like writing servlet without the tedious part of printing HTML. So if you know servlet, you pretty much already know JSP. The problem is that in servlet, we were mixing HTML in code. And now in JSP, we are mixing code in HTML. Both cases mix the presentation part of the application with the processing part. And they lead to the same problems that the code becomes difficult to read, difficult to reuse, and difficult to maintain. For example, if you really focus, you can see what this code does. But you probably don't want to be the developer who has to maintain lots of code like this. The right way to use JSP is to use it as a template engine, which combines data with templates to produce documents. In other words, JSPs are used for displaying data, but nothing else. This, of course, raises a few questions of its own. In particular, something has to do the processing to produce the data to be displayed. Who's going to do that? And if we don't use Java code in JSP, what do we use for displaying data? This takes us to the very important, widely used architecture called Model View Controller Architecture, or MVC. Under this architecture, an application can be divided into three parts: models that represent data, views that display the user interface, and the controllers that handle all the processing. This diagram shows how a request is processed in a web application using the MVC architecture. First, the browser sends a request to the controller. The controller processes the request, and based on the request, updates some data. The controller then forwards the request and maybe some additional data to the view, and the view generates a response that is sent back to the browser. Notice that everything on the right-hand side model, controller, and view are all on the server, and only the browser is on the client. MVC architecture is widely used in both GUI and web development. For web development, the vast majority of web frameworks, regardless of whether the programming language is Java or Python or something else, use the MVC architecture. Depending on the language and the technology, there are lots of different ways to implement models, controllers, and views. In this course, we use regular Java class for models, servlets for controllers, and the JSP for views. An example of a model class is a guestbook entry class. It's just a regular Java class representing some data. Such a class sometimes is also called a bin or a podro, plain old Java object. Let's look at an example and see how we can structure an MVC web application. The example itself is simple. We'll have a form that let a user enter two numbers, and we will process the form submission and display the sum. Like most web applications, this one is, again, data plus operations. In an MVC application, the first thing we do is to identify data and create model classes if necessary. In the guestbook example, we created a guestbook entry model class, but here we only have 3 integers, so no extra class necessary. After data models, we need to identify operations we need to implement. The rule of thumb is we want to use 1 servlet per operation, with the exception that if there's a form involved, we usually use 1 servlet for 2 operations, do get to display the form and do post to process the form. We no longer use servlet to generate HTML. It's the job of JSP now. And for each page, we'll use 1 JSP. Following these rules, we can see that we'll have 2 JSPs and 1 servlet as the controller. Now let's implement this. Usually we'll start by creating the model classes, but for this example, there's no need because there are only 3 integers. So we start by creating our controller, and we'll call this controller, well, we first need to put it in package. As before, I'll put it in say 3220.servlet, and controller name, I'll call it add_controller. The name really doesn't matter. Oftentimes I like to put controller in the class name to indicate that it's a controller class. And we'll have 2 methods, do get and do post. Before the do get will try to generate a HTML response, but now since we are using MVC, what the controller will do is it will simply forward the request to a JSP to generate the form. So here we'll do something called request, get request dispatcher, and we will dispatch it to a JSP, and we'll call it add form.jsp. Add form.jsp. And then we'll say forward request and response. And then we'll create the add form JSP. By the way, notice that after I change the default encoding, now it generates UTF-8 encoding for the JSP. And here, the view should display a form, and this form should submit back to the same application. So I'll say form. The action is back to the controller. So the action will be add controller. And the method will be post, because doPost will handle it. And we'll have two fields. We'll say A is input text, name is A, and B is the same, except that the name will be B, and we'll have a button that says add. Now we have this JSP, and let's run this servlet. Where is it? Okay, so the do-get part works. Very importantly, I like you to pay attention to the address bar. Notice that the address or the URL for the application is the controller URL. It goes to add controller, and that is because for MVC web application, request should always be sent to a controller, never sending a request directly to view. So the request gets to the controller. If you look at the controller code, there's nothing in here that actually generates this file, this form. And that's because we are forwarding this request to the JSP, and the JSP is generating this form. So this is how it looks like. Request goes to controller. There's no data processing for this operation. The controller simply forwards the request to view. View generates response. If we look at the code, most of this is what we have seen most of this before. The only thing new is this one, get request dispatcher and forward. This is a method we use to forward a request from a servlet to a JSP, or in MVC terminology, forwarding a request from a controller to a view. The argument to get request dispatcher is the path to a JSP file under the project. Slash here represent the root path of the project. So, excuse me, if the JSP is directly under web content, it's slash. Now let's talk a little bit about the difference between forward and redirect. They sound pretty similar, but they are in fact quite different. On the left-hand side is a forward using request get dispatcher forward. Notice that there's only one pair of request response involved here. The request first arrives at the servlet, then the same request gets forwarded to a JSP, and then the JSP generates a response. In this case, there's only one request, one response. In the case of redirect, notice that there are two requests and two responses. The first request arrives at the servlet, and the servlet sends back a response directly. Redirect is a special response. If you recall, it's a response with a status code in the 300 range. This response basically tells the browser to immediately send a second request to a different URL, and that request gets its own response. Okay, so now let's implement the doPost part. After a user enters some values for A and B and click Add, it should submit to doPost. So just like before, we'll do integer pass int request get parameter So now we have three data items, A and B and sum, and we want to pass these three data items to a JSP for display. We know how to forward the request. We'll simply say forward the request to a JSP called addResult. But how do we pass the data from this servlet to this JSP? This is where we use request set attribute. You'll probably notice that the API here is quite similar to servlet context set attribute and HTTP session set attribute. Indeed, we are looking at a new scope here called request scope. We know application scope data will stay in application scope for the duration of the application. We know session scope data lasts for the duration of the session. Any data we stored in request scope will be there during the processing of the request. Once the response is sent back to the client, any data in the request scope will be removed. Request scope is mostly used for parsing data from controller to view, because after that we don't need the data anymore. So here we can say request set attribute A and set request attribute A and then B and then sum. And inside the JSP, let's create it first. And result, we can say the sum of A and B is sum. And if we refresh and give it 100 and 200, add, we can see it says the sum of 100 and 200 is 300. Indeed, it displays it here. Of course, we didn't really cover this syntax yet. As we mentioned before, this is called expression language, and we'll talk more about this in the next video. So this is how a MVC web application looks like. Despite the the example being pretty simple, it does show all the basic elements involved in MVC architecture. There are a few things I'd like to emphasize about this and MVC in general. First, requests should always go to controller first. This is because JSPs usually need data from controllers to produce response. We don't want user to access them directly. For example, if a user simply types in add result JSP, they won't get anything. It will simply show the sum of empty and empty is empty. And that, of course, is not something we want to show to the user. So remember, always request always should go to, request should always go to controllers first. A common technique is to hide JSPs under webinf, so users cannot access them directly. Webinf is a special folder in Java web applications. Anything under webinf cannot be accessed by client. So, for example, we can move both add form and add result into webinf. So now they are here. And if a user tries to go to the JSP directly, of course, it's no longer under this path. But even if they just add webinf in front, they won't be able to access it because webinf is a special folder. Any request directly to webinf will be ignored by the application server. However, we can access those in our servlet. All we need to do is change this to webinf and change this to webinf, and let's go to add controller. So this still works, and this still works. A common error that people see is when the JSP is not in the right place. For example, let me move add form outside webinf. And if we go back and try to run this code again, we'll see a 404 error. Pay attention to the error message. It says webinf/addForm.jsp not found. This error message should be pretty clear, telling you that your JSP is not in the right place. And if I move it back to webinf and try again, now it works again, and now it works again. So first important thing, requests always go to controllers first. And second, controllers should not generate HTML, but now because now it's the JSP's job. Notice that our servlets no longer have the print statements in them. And finally, JSPs are only used for display purpose. That means there shouldn't be any Java code in them. Okay, so this is a brief introduction to JSP and the MVC architecture. In the next video, we'll learn more about expression language and how to use it in JSP.